Rosalyn Ferris had gone 3 days without water, and that morning, standing ankle-deep in dust where a stream should have been running, she found something buried in the ground that was about to change everything. She didn't know who had done it yet. She only knew that someone had decided her family didn't deserve to survive. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet when Rosalyn walked down to check the ditch her grandfather had dug by hand back in 1938. Instead of water, she found packed earth and a steel culvert pipe that hadn't been there a week before. Behind her, 40 head of cattle waited at a stock tank that hadn't refilled since Tuesday. Ahead of her, 600 feet of buried steel. And past that, a construction fence with a sign that read Vance Highland Development, future home of Stonebridge Estates. Her son Eli, 11 years old, was already crouched at the edge of the buried section, running his palm across a patch of grass that was greener and wetter than anything around it. "Mom," he said, "something's still coming through down there." She almost told him to hush and help load the truck. She almost missed it completely. That patch of grass was about to change everything. Cedar Fork Farm had survived droughts, a dead husband, 2 bad hay years, and a bank that called twice a month. What it had never survived was going without water. Rosalyn ran cattle on 200 acres irrigated by gravity since before her grandfather's time. Snowmelt off the ridge, gathered into the ditch, carried 3 miles downhill by nothing but slope and patience. No pumps, no electric bill, just an old channel that knew exactly where to go. That system had a name most of her neighbors had long forgotten. A gravity-fed irrigation system, dependent entirely on elevation and an unbroken channel. Break that channel anywhere along its length, and everything below it runs dry, no matter how much water is still moving above. Vance Highland Development had spent 2 years buying land along the ridge, parcel by parcel, building what they called Stonebridge Estates. Luxury lots, mountain views, backed by out-of-state money and more lawyers than the whole county had neighbors. Preston Vance himself had made Rosalyn 3 offers on Cedar Fork Farm, each one polite, each one low, each one refused. "You don't need this much land for cattle," he told her once at the county fair, smiling the whole time. "Water's expensive to maintain. I'm offering you an easy way out." She told him the farm wasn't for sale. She hadn't expected him to simply take her water instead. Within a week, the alfalfa started showing stress, leaves curling inward, the sure sign of a crop pulling from its own reserves. Within 2 weeks, the stock tank ran dry for the first time in Rosalyn's life. Within 3, she was hauling water in a rented tanker truck at a price that made her banker's calls sound almost friendly by comparison. The county said the ditch easement was under review. Vance Highland's attorneys called the buried pipe temporary drainage infrastructure. Neither explanation survived a 5-minute walk along that ditch, but neither one needed to. It only needed to buy time. Neighbors started talking. Some said she should take the money while it was still on the table. Others quietly worried they'd be next. A few stopped calling altogether, unwilling to get caught between a widow and a company that funded half the county's road paving. At night, after Eli was asleep, Rosalyn started doing the math on a legal pad at the kitchen table. Feed costs, water hauling, what was left in the account after the bank's monthly call. The numbers never landed anywhere good. She'd sit there long after the lamp should have been off, listening to a house that used to sound like running water, and now just sounded like silence. Rosalyn tried everything a reasonable person tries. A call to the state water engineer's office, a records request at the courthouse, a visit to a lawyer who quoted a retainer she didn't have. Every door opened onto another closed one. That's when Eli's patch of grass stopped being just a curiosity. Days before the pipe went in, he'd already noticed one stretch of ground near the old ditch that stayed cool and faintly damp, even in July, when everything around it baked dry. Cattails grew there that grew nowhere else on the property. He'd mentioned it once, half joking. She'd told him it was probably just a low spot. After the ditch went dry, that patch was the only green thing left for 100 yards. He went back out with a shovel, mostly out of boredom. 8 inches down, the shovel struck stone, not a loose rock. Flat, worked stone, laid in a line, like something built rather than dropped. "Mom," he said again, louder this time, "you need to see this." What Eli had found was the capstone of an old stone-lined channel, buried under nearly a century of soil, running straight toward the base of the ridge instead of parallel to the modern ditch, the way any recent construction would. Rosalyn called the one person in the county who might recognize masonry that old. Denise Calder, the county surveyor, showed up the next morning with a notebook older than her truck. She didn't bring answers. She brought better questions. From the courthouse archive, she pulled a set of 1930 survey plats showing something the current county maps had left out entirely. A second water right, filed but never fully developed, describing an intake tunnel feeding straight from a spring inside the ridge, built years before the modern ditch was ever dug. "If this is real," Denise said, tracing a faded line on the old plat, "there's a second water source on this property nobody's touched in almost 90 years, and it wouldn't run through that culvert at all." Rosalyn's kitchen table became a war room, one specialist at a time. A hydrologist tested the damp soil and confirmed what Denise suspected. An underground aquifer connection was still active, still feeding a trickle through the old channel after nearly a century of neglect. "Whoever built this," she said, "understood hydraulic head better than half the engineers I graduated with. They didn't need pumps. They used elevation and gravity, and it's still trying to work." A retired irrigation contractor walked the buried line with a probe rod and confirmed the tunnel ran another 200 feet into the ridge before a partial collapse. Not destroyed, just clogged with decades of settled sediment. An archivist at the Historical Society found the missing piece. Correspondence from the 1930s describing a cooperative water-sharing agreement between 3 original homestead families, including Rosalyn's grandfather, who had jointly funded the tunnel's construction before the modern ditch made it seem unnecessary, and a water rights attorney, finally willing to work on a deferred fee, explained the part that mattered most. Continuous use, even a modest ongoing trickle, is usually enough to defeat a claim of abandonment. The tunnel's flow, the one Eli had found by accident, was the only proof that the right had never gone unused long enough to lose it. Each expert solved exactly one piece. None of them solved the whole thing, and every step forward came with a cost. Restoring the tunnel meant excavation permits, and the permit office moved at a pace that had nothing to do with urgency. Proving the water right meant tracking down the original 1930s filing, which had been misfiled for decades under a different family's name entirely. Funding the excavation meant a cost Rosalyn couldn't cover on her own, until 2 of the 3 founding families, descendants of the men who built the tunnel in the first place, agreed to split the expense once they understood their own names were on that original filing too. Vance Highland didn't sit still either. Preston Vance's attorneys filed an objection, arguing the excavation threatened the structural integrity of the new subdivision's grading work, the same grading work that had buried the ditch to begin with. A few neighbors, worried about their own easements getting scrutinized, pushed back against reopening old water records at all. The county held a single public hearing on the excavation permit in a room too small for how many people showed up. Some came to support Rosalyn. Others came to ask carefully whether reopening a 90-year-old filing might put their own long-ignored paperwork under the same microscope. Preston Vance sat near the back, saying nothing, letting his attorney do the talking. When Denise laid the original 1930 plat next to the current county map, the room went quiet in a different way. Not hostile anymore, just surprised at how much had been sitting in a drawer the whole time. The permit passed by a narrow vote, not a victory yet, just permission to start finding out. Clearing 200 feet of century-old tunnel took 11 days, hand tools for the last stretch where machinery couldn't reach. They found the original stone sluice gate near the spring intake, still functional after a light rebuild, a simple mechanism that let the family control flow by hand instead of by pump. When they opened the gate for the first test, the water didn't rush. It arrived slowly, the way gravity always does, filling the old stone channel inch by inch until it reached daylight. At the section Eli had first uncovered, he was the one who saw it. The same cattails, the same patch of ground that had started everything, running wet again for the first time in his life. Your great-grandfather's generation didn't have concrete trucks or diesel pumps, the old contractor told him, crouching beside the water. They had shovels, stone, and a level. They figured out exactly how much the ground had to drop, foot by foot, to keep water moving without a single machine. That's not luck. That's math done by hand. And it still works 100 years later if nobody messes with the slope. The historical filing, once properly indexed, reframed the entire fight. Vance Highland's purchase of the adjoining ridge parcels 3 years earlier had included language explicitly excluding unresolved historic water claims from the sale, which meant Preston Vance's own legal team had known about the tunnel's potential existence long before construction began, and had priced that risk into the deal instead of disclosing it. Burying the modern ditch hadn't been a mistake in a drainage plan. It had been an attempt to make the older, more valuable water right look abandoned before anyone thought to look closely enough to find it. Eli's cattails had quietly undone a plan built entirely on that assumption. The water court didn't hand Rosalyn a fortune. It confirmed what the evidence already showed. The 1930 water right was valid, continuously exercised, and hers to share with the 2 other founding families, exactly as her grandfather intended. Vance Highland was ordered to restore the buried culvert at its own expense and to redesign its drainage plan around a water right it could no longer pretend didn't exist. Preston Vance didn't go to prison. He didn't lose his company. He simply lost the shortcut he'd been counting on and gained a redesigned bill that made his old low offers look almost generous by comparison. By late autumn, the alfalfa had come back green, the cattle had water again, and 3 families who'd barely spoken in a decade were sharing maintenance duties on a channel their grandfathers had built together. They set up a rotation for the tunnel and the sluice gate, the same kind of arrangement their grandfathers had written into a letter almost a century earlier, then let quietly lapse, once the modern ditch made cooperation feel unnecessary. Denise filed the corrected water right herself, making sure it would never sit misfiled under the wrong name again. The attorney waived what remained of his fee once the case closed, telling Rosalyn that cases like hers were the reason he'd gone into water law in the first place. Eli still walks out to that same patch of ground some afternoons after school, just to check the cattails. He says it's habit. Rosalyn thinks it's something closer to pride, not in what they won, but in what her son noticed, when everyone older than him had simply walked past it for years. Has something small that nobody else noticed ever ended up changing the whole direction of your life? Tell us what it was.